keep us on track with time here. My name is Tessa Barron. I'm our Disaster Preparedness Program Associate at SVP, and I'm going to be leading our next session today in the Faithful Preparedness, Faithful Resilience webinar series. So for folks that have had a chance to join so far, this is a 6-part webinar series. And so we started at the beginning of the year. It's bi-monthly, and so we're spanning throughout the entire year. And the session today is going to be focused on different things that you as community leaders really want to make sure that you're aware of, so we can equip you with knowledge, information, tools, and resources that not only are going to help you get prepared, because we of course want folks to get prepared at the individual level, but also you all play such key roles as community leaders, and so we want to make sure that we're giving you this information so that way you can then distribute that out to your networks and your communities and the clients that you serve. So I don't mean to get ahead of myself here. We've got a pretty great session today, jam-packed with a lot of helpful information. But I'm actually going to go ahead and pass it over to my colleague, Leanne, who's going to kick us off, explain a little bit more about who we are at SVP, our main mission, and our main goals at the org. And then we're going to circle back to the content. So I'll pass it over to Leanne, and then I'll jump back in later on to get us into the session.
Thank you, Tessa, and good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Leanne Ortiz, and I get the pleasure to be a part of SVP's Prepare team, and I'm grateful to connect with you all on this Thursday evening. As you can see, this session is being recorded, so if you need to leave early, we'll be sending the recording afterward. Also, please feel free to post any questions in the chat, and we'll address them at the end of this session. If anyone in the audience has experience with any storm events, we encourage you to share effective measures you've taken in the chat so that we can continue to learn and expand our education on disaster preparedness together. We would also like to take a moment to thank Creation Justice Ministries for their steadfast partnership in the series, and we hope you find today's webinar informative and inspiring. So before I hop into SVP and its mission, I'll pass it on over to Avery for the prayer.
Thanks, Lan, and thanks, Tess. And I'll echo the gratitude for this partnership. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Avery Davis Lamb. I'm co-executive director at Creation Justice Ministries, and we work to educate, equip, and mobilize Christians across the country to protect, restore, and rightly share God's creation. And one of our central missions is to help communities of faith prepare to be hubs of resilience, to help their communities weather the physical, spiritual, and social storms of the climate crisis. So we're deeply grateful for the partnership with SVP, with the expertise that SVP brings to this partnership in the 6-part webinar series. And it's been a delight to host all of these programs so far. With that, I am glad to offer an opening prayer. So I ask you all to please join me in prayer. Like Job in the whirlwind, or Jonah in the storm at sea, we come before you in awe of your power, God. We recognize that today's storms and today's whirlwinds are not your judgment on your people, but the distortion of natural systems, too often through our own sin and hubris. We pray that as the storms and whirlwinds of the climate crisis accelerate around us, may our sanctuaries be a place of refuge and resilience, where all of God's creation might be protected and sustained, and from which we, people of God, might be sent forth to bring healing and to bring justice. Amen.
Thank you, Avery. Next slide, please. For those who might be unfamiliar with SVP, let me give you a brief overview. SVP is a disaster recovery and resilience nonprofit dedicated to shrinking the time between disaster and recovery. We began our journey right after Hurricane Katrina in San Bernard Parish in New Orleans with a mission to support those who were at their breaking point and help them return to safe, sanitary, and secure housing conditions as quickly as possible. Over the years, we've extended our reach and through different interventions have served dozens of communities nationwide. While SVP initially focused on long-term recovery, we've expanded our work to encompass the entire disaster cycle. Our approach includes 5 key interventions: rebuild, share, prepare, advise, and advocate. This comprehensive approach allows us to help communities prepare for disasters respond swiftly, and continue the critical work of recovery. Next slide, please. Today, I'll be going over a brief Prepare program overview. Next, we'll discuss how to build a culture of preparedness. We'll consider what that really means, how we can integrate it into conversations surrounding disaster recovery, and we can reframe these conversations by expanding upon what's included in disaster preparedness and planning. Lastly, we'll focus on 5 key interventions that you can take to keep you and your family safe. These actions include knowing your risk, making a plan, purchasing flood insurance, protecting your important documents, and lastly, taking actions to mitigate risk to your property. Next slide, please. In the Prepare program, we aim to better equip not only households, but different types of local leaders with the knowledge and capacity to make informed disaster preparedness decisions and build more disaster resilient communities. Next slide, please. At SVP, we believe that achieving personal and community resilience and mitigating risk requires the actions of policymakers, community leaders, and individual residents. Education drives these actions at the end of the day. So SVP's Prepare program offers a wide range of resources that can be used to take such actions, just like checklists, written guides, in-person trainings, and webinars. We recommend going to the Resource Hub or SVP's YouTube page to see the different types of resources and content produced by the Prepare team and its partners. Next slide, please. We also do utilize train the trainer approach with many partners to be able to enable community leaders to make local campaigns and initiatives more impactful. But we also do training directly to households. Some of these trainings the team does are geared towards topics like risk identification and analysis, navigating disaster insurance, and business continuity and preparedness. So without further ado, I'll turn things over to the one and only Tessa Barron, Preparedness Program Associate, who will be diving into how to create a culture of preparedness and the key actions to prepare your household. So thank you, and I hope you all enjoy.
Alrighty, thank you, Leanne. Okay, so we're going to start off today, like Leanne just walked us through, with a brief segment on building a culture of preparedness. And for folks that joined 2 sessions back, this might sound a little bit familiar. The whole session was on, what this term means and how we can actually achieve building towards a culture of preparedness. So today we're just going to do a brief overview of that session, and we're going to start there because it really did help lay the foundation for this presentation and the future preparedness presentations that are going to make up the rest of the series. So just a brief overview that's going to set the tone of what it means to build towards a culture of preparedness. We know that, we're living in this period of time that's characterized by these storms that are more pervasive and more intense and more frequent. And unfortunately, they're not going anywhere. We can't stop them from happening, but what we can do is get ourselves prepared, get our communities prepared, get our families, our properties prepared, and start to have these conversations, again, to build our personal levels of preparedness and to help our communities build towards greater resilience. This is a really helpful graphic that we like to share because it really helps us understand what we mean when we talk about a culture of preparedness. So if you see this chart here, and if you could see my mouse, I'm circling the beginning of this is the disaster cycle. And so I'm circling the beginning of the disaster cycle. Traditionally, when we think about preparedness, it is contained, it is siloed to the beginning of the disaster spectrum. Then we have a disaster strike, and then post-disaster, we're focused importantly on response, on short-term recovery, on long-term recovery, on building resilience. But what's most important here is, with this idea of a culture of preparedness, we need to be thinking about how we can best prepare ourselves and how we can best prepare our communities throughout the entire disaster spectrum. We can't just be thinking about it pre-storm. It's so important that we embed preparedness topics and actions and conversations throughout the entire disaster cycle. And so it's, of course, going to look a little bit different. We're going to interact with preparedness differently at different points throughout the spectrum, but it's important that it's a continuous process. It's continuous conversations that we're having. The other thing to share here before we get into really the meat and potatoes of the content today is this idea that it's going to take a layered approach. And that's why it's so important that you guys are all on this call today, because you really help plug into this second layer here of community. But starting with the first layer of the household, we at SVP understand that disaster resilience, and the first part of that is preparedness. It does start at the individual level, at the household level, but it's going to take a layered approach. Us as community leaders, we're going to be able to help equip individuals and households, whether they're homeowners or renters, with tools and information to get prepared. But it's really important for us to understand that it's going to take this layered approach. If we do all that we can to get ourselves prepared and all that we can to get our communities prepared, well, that way, if and when, unfortunately, when a disaster does strike in the future, those limited government resources can reach those that were not able to take preparedness actions, and that, otherwise would not be able to get themselves into good shape post-event without that government assistance. And so, that's what we're talking about here with these different key players involved. It's playing our role in building towards a culture of preparedness. So now we're going to get into the actual actions here. And like Leanne said, this is going to be a presentation that's focused on 5 key preparedness actions that not only, again, we want you all to take as individuals with families, homes, and loved ones, but also, again, as community leaders. And so the first is knowing your risks. And so, like I was starting to say, we live in this period of time where we're seeing these storms at an increased frequency and intensity, and they're just not going anywhere. Because of that, it is so important that we get ourselves prepared. And the first part of getting prepared is knowing what our risks are. This really is the absolute foundation to proper and sufficient and adequate preparedness, is understanding what we could be up against. And so I'll share a couple tools in just a couple slides here, but the most important thing that I want to draw your attention to here on this slide is the third bullet point. And so, a lot of these actions that we're going to be talking about are going to be applicable across different disaster types, but given the time of year, given that we're in hurricane season and that frequent floods can happen throughout the year, but hurricanes and floods frequently go hand in hand, what I want to draw your attention to is this piece of information that government flood maps, so we're talking about FEMA's flood maps, are not going to be reliable indicators of a property's flood risk. And so what I mean by that is that these FEMA flood maps are going to show us one of 2 things. You have a flood risk, you're in a flood zone, or you're not, and you don't have a flood risk. And that's binary. It only gives us one of 2 options. We have a risk or we don't. And it really doesn't take into account all the many different factors that paint the picture of an individual's flood risk. We know that floods and, flood risks are dynamic. And so just looking at a map that's going to show us one of 2 options is, again, not going to be an accurate depiction of an individual's flood risk. And so the tool that we want to equip folks with to work around that is a tool called Risk Factor. I'll share more about the tool in 1 second, but I want to start this off by saying this Risk Factor is SBP's top recommendation of tools to use for individuals to understand what their individual flood risks are. But we want to make sure that folks have a lot of tools in their toolbox. And so if an individual does want to look at government flood maps, it can be a helpful starting point, but it has to be one of many different tools or multiple different tools that are used, because again, it's not a reliable indicator. But I do just want to make that caveat that it certainly can be used, but this is our top recommendation at SBP. And so we want to, make sure that we're giving you as many tools in your tools box to use as possible. And so riskfactor.com is a really wonderful tool that was developed by the First Street Foundation. And it's so fantastic because it allows households to plug in their zip code or their address. So it really gives you your individualized risk score, and it gives folks a score or a ranking from 1 to 10 on their specific risks to extreme heat, extreme wind, flooding, and wildfire. So those 4 disaster and hazard types. And so it really offers a really nice and comprehensive picture for folks of what different hazard types they could be facing. And so that's why we want folks to start there when we're talking about how do we best get folks prepared. Well, you need to know what your risks are, so that way you can make informed decisions and plan accurately. And so knowing what those risks are with this tool is absolutely where we want to encourage folks to start. So risk factor is our top recommendation at SVP. But another tool that we like to share out in conjunction with risk factor is FEMA's National Risk Index. And I like this one because if you recall, risk factor shows us our individual level risk score, but FEMA's National Risk Index will show you your county's risks. And so that's really important because we know that risks aren't going to impact just a single household. A disaster, if it's approaching, it's not going to impact just a household. It's going to have an effect on the community as a whole. And so in order to properly equip ourselves with all the information that we need in order to make informed decisions, we need to know what the whole community's risk is. And so this, again, is a nice complementary tool that we often like to point households towards if, say, they had a chance to look at risk factor, but they're really interested and they really want to learn more. This is a great secondary tool that we point folks towards. So those are a couple tools that we often direct people towards, but that really is only half the battle of knowing what your future risks may or may not be. The other side of the coin here that's so important is knowing when disasters are coming as they're approaching. And so this means staying plugged into information sources like the local news or local weather apps, or maybe your community has another type of emergency alert system that can be downloaded in advance on a phone or a tablet or other type of technology. And again, this is so important because, say, a storm is approaching and the guidance from local public officials is that folks really need to evacuate. Well, we want folks to be plugged into these information sources so that way they receive the information and they can, if we're talking about a situation where evacuation is the top guidance, they can evacuate and they can get out of harm's way before they then are in a dangerous place and could then get impacted by that storm. So this is a top safety precaution that people know that knowing your risks not only is what could happen in the future, but as risks are approaching, as storms are coming, we need to know what we could be dealing with. What I want to draw your attention to here is NOAA's weather radio. And this is a really important one that's going to help us stay in the know and stay plugged into information sources because this is battery powered. And so power outages can happen, unfortunately, with any type of disaster event at any time throughout the year. And so, if we're relying on the weather app on our cell phone, for example, the news app on our cell phone, but we lose charge fairly quickly, then we're in a really sticky situation. And so having a battery powered way that we can make sure that we're staying plugged into these sources of really important and critical information is going to go a long way in keeping us safe, just as long as you have your batteries. And so we'll talk about a couple, a list of different items. We want to make sure folks are safeguarding in advance and stockpiling in advance, and batteries are one of those. But when it comes to knowing your risks, to recap us here, it's riskfactor.com is that top recommendation that's going to give a really comprehensive and full depiction of a family's flood risk, an extreme heat, extreme wind, and wildfire, and downloading these different tools in advance and familiarizing yourself with these tools. We don't want the first time that we're looking at an emergency alert system on our phone to be when we receive that emergency alert. We want to be familiar with the sounds and the alarms. Some of them can be quite loud and alarming. And so we want to know, what that's all about before we're in a disaster event. So moving on here, the second action item that we're going to be talking about is household recovery planning. But before we get into that, those specific items, I first wanted to share a story of Bill and his wife, Sophia, who is not pictured. But Bill and his wife, Sophia, were clients of SVP's. And, they lived in Naples, Florida, and they got impacted. And this is such an important story because this is an example of a family that did not necessarily think they were going to get hit as hard as they ultimately did. And so Bill was a client, but thankfully they worked with us and we were able to get them back in good shape post-event. But during their time working with SVP, they shared that they weren't paying attention to those evacuation signs. They were not plugged into information sources, and they didn't have what they need when it came time to evacuate. And so this is a really important cautionary tale that I wanted to share to help ground this presentation. And, disasters impact real people. And as community leaders, we want to make sure that we're doing all that we can to get folks out of harm's way. And disaster preparedness is a huge part of that puzzle. So going back to emergency planning, preparedness planning, and recovery planning, we're now going to be taking a deep dive into these 3 specific steps. So when we talk about a preparedness plan, that's the overarching plan. We have that broken down into 3 key steps, and I'm going to share a lot more information about all of these, but I did just want to take a moment to clarify the terms, since I know there are 3 different types of plans on this slide, and I want to make sure that we're all on the same page before we get into the content. So again, the preparedness plan is the overarching plan. Each of these 3 steps that we're going to be talking about are going to be steps that you're going to take towards building a preparedness plan. The first, pretty straightforward, pulling together your disaster supplies kit. Again, this is an action that most folks are aware of when you think of how to get prepared for disasters, but it would be remiss if we didn't at least share a quick slide or 2 of our top recommendations, but we'll be pretty snappy about pretty quickly with that. The second step is making an emergency plan. And so, emergency plan, this is the plan that we're going to want to enact in a disaster. And so we're going to talk about some top guidance and things that we want people to be considering before a disaster. So that way it's like muscle memory. They know what to do. They know how to act to stay safe during any type of disaster event and can get out of harm's way. We're going to spend the majority of the time, though, talking about step 3. And that's a recovery plan. When we're talking about a recovery plan, what we mean is a financial plan. So how to best prepare finances for a disaster. And so this is where we're going to spend the majority of the session today, because this is something that it's a very important piece of the preparedness puzzle, but it often gets overlooked. And so we have a lot of curriculum built out in this area. So again, we'll spend a lot of time here, but recovery plan is our financial planning piece. So just wanted to clarify that. So our emergency planning basics here are categorized into 4 main buckets. Supplies, we'll talk about it. And what I'm particularly excited to share out in this session is that not only do we have a list of different recommended supplies, but we also we're going to go into some top recommendations for how you can pull together your kit in a cost-effective and budget-friendly way. We know that sometimes when we take a look at these long, comprehensive lists, checklists of different items to have in a kit, it's great to have all that information in one place, but it can seem overwhelming. And so we'll share some top tips on budget-friendly approaches. Communication and information. So not only does this go back to getting plugged into those information sources and getting familiarized with those in advance, but it's also so important that your lines of communication with your family and your friends and your loved ones are strengthened, and you know how to stay in contact with those that are most important to you in disasters. Evacuations and sheltering, of course, a very important thing is that we need to keep top of mind to have plans of, what are our emergency evacuation routes, and do we have a backup route in case the first one is blocked? We need to make sure that folks are equipped with information on how do I get out of harm's way if if a disaster is coming. So that's key. And then sheltering, if folks are going to receive guidance from local officials that sheltering in place is the best move, well, we want to make sure that folks know, what to do. Take, for example, this session is going to focus most heavily on hurricanes and flooding, but say we were talking about a tornado type of event or other high wind event, we want to make sure that folks know where in their house or their apartment is most safe to hunker down and wait out the storm. So these are just our emergency planning basics that are going to help guide our conversation. So this is, not going to go through everything on this list, but this is a really great starting point for households of a bunch of basics. Food, water, medications, things of that nature. These are all things that we want folks to have in advance because, say a disaster strikes and it's unsafe to go out and to go to the store and to get these items. Well, we really want folks to have them in advance so that they have what they need. Something else that I want to draw your attention to here is this is, again, a starting point. Every family is going to have their family specific needs. And so we always try to urge households to think through what are those unique needs of your family that need to get reflected in your kit. Maybe you have a pet. Maybe there's an infant or young children in the household, and they have certain needs, whether that's infant baby formula or diapers or just small toddler toys to occupy a child during a disaster event. So whatever that may be, we want to make sure that those family specific needs are accounted for and that are in the kit. So not just food and water and medications, although those are obviously very important. But we want these kits to be personalized so they really meet a family's specific needs. So moving along here, and the next thing that we're going to talk about here is making our emergency plans. And when we talk about our emergency plans, these are our action items. So we just looked at some items to have in our disaster supplies kits. Well, our action item here, and then we really want to make sure that our community members are aware about is who, for example, with the emergency supplies items, who in our family is going to be responsible for checking that kit on an annual basis and restocking if any items need to be restocked. Another action item that we're thinking about that we just discussed with staying plugged into information sources is who in our family is going to be responsible for monitoring those key updates and alerts as they come in and communicating that information out to family and friends and loved ones and maybe neighbors who maybe are elderly and aren't on their phones checking the technology and checking these certain updates. So this communication plan, staying plugged into information sources, but also communicating with our networks is such a key part of emergency planning. We're now going to shift gears here and talk about making a recovery plan. This is going to be an introductory and an exploratory look into what it means to make a recovery plan and what are the four main mechanisms of recovery funding that a household may be able to rely on post-event. So the four main categories that we're going to talk about are savings, credit and loans, disaster aid, and insurance. This is a helpful slide if perhaps you're having a conversation with your community and you get to this point in the discussion about recovery plans and you realize, I don't actually think this family has had the chance to think through this quite yet. These are wonderful prompting questions that we always like to pose to folks if they haven't had a chance to think about how am I going to get my family and my household back in good repair post-disaster. So, and these are things that I encourage you to think through for your family and your specific needs as I walk through these four main categories. Which of these sources can I rely on if a disaster occurs? And if it's not a current part of disaster planning, how can the budget be reconfigured so that way we can make sure that recovery finances are tucked in whatever way, shape, or form is most fitting for your family's specific needs. So really helpful prompting questions. So when we talk about savings, we understand in this financial climate that it may not be possible for a family to set aside emergency savings. And if it's not possible, that's okay. We can only all do as much as we can to get ourselves prepared. It would be impossible to check off every single thing on an extensive, comprehensive disaster preparedness checklist. But if a family can set aside emergency funds, we absolutely want them to try to. And that's so important because disasters by nature are unpredictable. We have, before disasters strike, we don't know what, all the impacts are that can occur. And so we want to make sure that we're being proactive and we're getting ahead of it. And we have that emergency cash set aside for whatever it is we might be dealing with post-event. So maybe that's long-term stays away from home. Maybe a family was proactive and did set aside some emergency funds, but they're dealing with a longer term stay away from home than what they had anticipated. And maybe they don't have the funds for that. So that's something we want to make sure that we're avoiding. Maybe we're looking at something like the cost of clearing debris, or there's an increase in the price of fuel or food or water or whatever that might be. These basic and essential items that folks need to stay safe. There could be a hike in the price of that, and so that's one route that we could then route the emergency cash, and we'd be in good shape. Deductibles, I know I went out of line here, but deductibles are our second one. And we'll talk more about insurance in a little further into the presentation, but deductibles are a huge one. And we want to make sure that households are thinking of before a disaster strikes. If a household decides that their best course of action is to rely on disaster insurance to fund their recovery, that's wonderful. We'll talk more about it, but that's our top recommendation, is that folks get the right insurance. But a key part of that is that folks need to be able to pay that deductible, so that amount out of pocket, before they can expect to receive any type of funds from their insurance company. And so that, again, is a critical part of relying on that disaster insurance coverage, is having those deductibles, being able to meet those deductibles rather. Moving on here, this is just going to be a high-level overview. The most important thing is that we want households to be aware of the fact that loan and credit options are out there, and they might be fitting for a family's specific needs. We have here that the Small Business Administration offers low-interest disaster loans to homeowners and renters, which is an important thing to clarify, post-event. Well, Small Business Administration. A household might get a little bit confused just by the name of that. And disasters, again, are very post-disaster periods, especially, are very hectic and traumatic times. I mean, there's a lot going on. And a household, if they don't have the knowledge beforehand that they could look into a low interest loan option from the SBA, they might just disregard any information they get about the SBA, because they might think to themselves, I'm a household, I'm not a small business, this isn't applicable. So just having this information, even a base level of information about the different options that are out there, is absolutely going to go a long way in making sure that households know what they can rely on post-event. We want folks to, if they have the time, to go through an exercise of maybe even talking to a financial counselor and really doing a deep dive to explore the options that are out there, including loan and credit options. But even just knowing that these options exist is huge. So moving along here, this is an important one to cover, because most folks, when they think of how am I going to get myself and my house in good shape post-event, what are the recovery funds that are available to me? Well, they think of disaster aid. And this is so important because there are some issues that we need to talk about here. And the first is a qualification issue. This is a little bit of a complex situation here, so bear with me, but this is so important. Say we're dealing with a situation where we have a homeowner, and the homeowner experiences a flood event, and they end up applying for federal aid, and they receive that federal aid to fix their house and get their house back in good repair. This homeowner then has an insurance mandate placed on their property because they received federal disaster aid. So they have an insurance mandate to maintain insurance for a like event. Okay, this may not be aware of the fact that there's an insurance mandate on the property. It's not information that the home seller is required to disclose to the home buyer. And so say this new family, again, who's unaware of this insurance mandate that's placed on their home, they may get impacted by a future disaster. They also might seek funding from FEMA, disaster aid from FEMA to fund the repairs. All of a sudden, they don't qualify. That's a qualification issue right there, an issue of limited access to repeat aid. And that really shows us that the onus needs to be on the homeowner to understand, do I qualify? And a lot of folks don't even know that this is something that they need to be researching. And so again, Equipping people with information to get prepared for disasters means telling people what they need to be aware of. So these qualification criteria, and more information I'll share in a slide or two here, we really want folks to keep this top of mind when they're going through an exercise of determining how am I going to fund my my recovery post-event should I be impacted. More on disaster insurance, because this is again something that folks most often think of when they think of how am I going to recover post-event. A disaster can be damaging, but it needs to reach a certain threshold that's then going to trigger a federal disaster declaration. If a disaster does not reach that threshold, there are no federal monies available for recovery. And if a family decided that their plan of action was to rely on federal disaster assistance and that assistance is not available, well, they're in a really bad situation post-event. So we definitely want to make sure we're avoiding that. Say all goes well, a household does qualify, they do apply, they get notice that they're going to receive funding, and there is funding available. Well, it still is going to take time. This is not the quickest process. And so that's problematic for a household. We can't have folks living in unsafe, unsanitary, and housing situations that aren't secure while they're waiting for these federal dollars to come in to then start their recovery. So this is why we're talking about all of these 4 buckets. We'll get to the 4th in a second. But again, this is why we're talking about these 4 different buckets, these 4 different mechanisms. So folks know, oh, there are other options out there. There are options that I have more agency and more control over. And maybe that actually is more fitting for my family's needs so we can get ourselves back in good shape afterwards. All of that to say, we absolutely want to encourage households and homeowners and renters to apply for federal disaster aid if they qualify and if it's available. Definitely want folks to take advantage of the resources that are out there and that are meant to get folks back in good shape. If a household does receive federal disaster aid and they are dissatisfied with the award amount, perhaps it's an insufficient amount and it's really not going to help a family really get back into good shape. We want to encourage folks to appeal that decision. This is a complicated process. And so just arming people with the information that they are well within their right to appeal a disaster aid decision to then increase their award amount. We want to make sure folks are aware of that. I'm not going to go too much into the process of appealing, but I do just want to share that we have a very robust FEMA appeals program on our website at SVP, but we have more information on our website if folks want to learn more. Absolutely encourage you to check that out. Okay, so moving along here, and thanks for bearing with me. I know it's a lot of information, this recovery and financial curriculum, but it is so important. So thanks for hanging in there. We're now going to talk about getting the right insurance. And so I've been mentioning that there are 4 different buckets or 4 different mechanisms of recovery funding. Insurance is the 4th, but since this is so important and we at SVP, it is our top recommendation that folks do get the right insurance. I pulled it out and I made it its own category, but I don't want to confuse folks with the organization there. So, like I've been alluding to, those with insurance are going to recover better and they're going to recover faster than those without. And so this statistic that I have down here really speaks for itself. We see the average award amount that one can expect to receive from FEMA is only $5,000. And then we compare that to the average award amount that one can expect to receive from a flood insurance payout. We see that that's just under $70,000. And so again, while we want folks to take advantage of the government resources that are out there, $69,000 is going to take a family much further in their recovery than this average $5,000 amount. And so as community leaders, if you're having these conversations with folks, if you have the chance to do so, what we like to do and what we encourage you to do is to encourage folks to take a look at their policy. We know there's a lot of technical jargon in there and it can be information overload. So slides like this we found to be really helpful to provide just an overview of the common standard components in an insurance policy. We're not going to go in depth on what these are. The key point here is we really want folks to start to gain some familiarity with these standard components of a homeowner's and a renter's insurance policy. And so we have homeowners is this main category here, but we did also bucket out renters insurance on the bottom. We have some more information that's specific to renters, but this training, as community leaders, we want to make sure that we're arming you with information to help everyone in your community. And so you might be dealing with homeowners. You might also be dealing with a strong renter population. And so it's really important that renters are not left out of this discussion. So this slide, again, shows an overview of standard components of a homeowner and renters insurance policy. And it's really important for folks to understand what's in their policy and what they're paying for. But just as important, and conversely, we want folks to know what's commonly excluded, what they're not paying for, what are gaps in their insurance policy that they might not have realized that they don't have proper coverage for. And so we have flood bolded and in red on the top of the list because the vast majority of homeowners and renters insurance policies do not include flood. That's a gap, and that needs to be filled with flood insurance coverage. And so this is another great tool that before we get into flood insurance coverage, that I just wanted to end this homeowners and renters section by sharing this tool, because this is, if you're talking to a community member and they feel burdened with information overload, this is their starting point. This is a really great tool that gives a comprehensive look at different insurance policies so folks can start to compare. And this is a screenshot here from the main page, but it is just helpful at a glance to be able to make those comparisons. So definitely something that I recommend that you look up and flag in your phone, so that way you can easily send it out to folks or pull it up and show folks if they're curious. So now we're shifting to talking about homeowners insurance. So at this point, we recognized that, there may very well be a gap in a homeowners or renters insurance policy, and that gap needs to be filled. So how to fill that? Flood insurance. This is a repeat of what I said, but this is something to drill home that the vast majority of homeowners and renters policies do not include flood. Another important thing here, and this is a common misconception, flood insurance is available for homeowners and renters. Again, common misconception that we see, so we wanted to emphasize that. What this looks like is you can picture that homeowners get the full coverage. They get the coverage for the structure because they own the property, they're homeowners, and they can get coverage for their contents inside of their home. For renters, we're just looking at contents only coverage because they don't own the property. So they don't, it's not within their purview to worry about insuring the property itself. This is great for renters because contents only insurance policies are cheaper, and it's a great way to make sure that they are prepared. So this goes back here, this last bullet point, that's, really important take home point. If you recall, back in the beginning of the presentation, we said that government flood maps are not reliable indicators of flood risk. They're binary, which means you either are in a flood zone or you're not. You either have a risk or you don't. But we talked about the fact that really flood risks are so much more dynamic than that. And, a binary yes or no is not going to capture all the factors that we need to be thinking about, but that can be a tool among many others in our toolbox. Well, what's, important in that same vein, on that same note, is that, again, whether you're in a flood zone or you're not in a flood zone, you certainly could still have flood risk. And that those outside of a flood zone, flood insurance actually is going to be cheaper. And so that's somewhere that we can really help start to move the needle. So an important point to emphasize there. So now we're in this understanding that flood insurance is going to be that tool to fill the gap in the homeowners and renters insurance policies. Where to go from there? Again, we understand that these conversations of disaster insurance and of insurance just in general can be overwhelming for folks that may not have any expertise in that area. And so where to point folks towards are, one, the National Flood Insurance Program, and that's FEMA's program. So that's our federal program. And that the vast majority of policies are tucked into FEMA's National Flood Insurance Program. So a great starting point for folks. But we do want to make sure that we're giving folks the full picture. And so it's important to explain to any individuals that you might be having these conversations with that private flood insurance options are increasingly becoming more available in some states. So that's, just something that we want to keep in mind. So here is a checklist that we absolutely encourage you to share out with any folks that might be just entering this disaster insurance space and not quite sure where to first begin. One, and this is, I'm going to sound like a broken record here, but we want to check that homeowners and renters insurance policy, see if there are any gaps in those policy. And remember, the vast majority of homeowners and renters insurance policies don't cover flooding. So that's a gap that needs to then be filled. We talked about deductibles, so we're going to bring that back to our conversation now of if a family is going to rely on insurance coverage, well, that deductible is so important. We need to be setting aside emergency cash that can go right to that deductible, so that way, a household can take advantage of their insurance policy and the monies that they should then receive to get their home repairs well underway. We talked about setting aside emergency cash, so I'm not going to go too much into that there. But then making a home inventory. This is a home inventory, I should say, is the process of walking around a home and taking videos and pictures of a home, and understanding and having written receipts of the value of the different items in a home, and often storing these online, so maybe on the iCloud or on a flash drive, or there are many different routes that folks can take to store their home inventory. But this is such an important one to start out with, because a home inventory, having that information on hand, is really going to help expedite the process of putting in an insurance claim or applying for federal aid. So definitely something that we want folks in action, preparedness action, that we want folks to be engaging with pre-disaster. So this is another one of those tricky things. And so bear with me again here, but this is a very important point, especially for you all as community leaders to be aware of, because if you encounter any households, homeowners specifically, that are dealing with this situation, they may be frustrated. This can potentially be very frustrating if households don't know that this is potentially a part of their process. So this is crucial. When we're talking about homeowners, rather, we're talking about a mortgage. And so the insurance contract is between the insurance company and the owner of the property. And again, if we're talking about a mortgage, we're talking about the owner being the mortgage holder. So the insurance contract is between the insurance company and the mortgage holder, not the homeowner. And so say a disaster happens and it reaches a certain level of damage. Well, in some states, it's required that the insurance company then writes the settlement check in the name of the mortgage holder. And oftentimes the mortgage holder will then release amounts to the homeowner in portions, installments. And again, this can be very frustrating for a household that, again, might not have been aware that this is the process that gets put into place once disaster damage reaches a certain level. They just want to get their home back in good condition. They just want to recover. But this is an important thing that goes into play, because contractor fraud is something that unfortunately, it's a massive issue in the disaster space, the recovery space specifically. And so this is a practice that really aims to reduce the amount of contractor fraud that happens. But again, this is a piece of information that we really want to arm households with, so that way they know what to expect, and then they'll be all the better for it. So this is a slide that I definitely encourage folks to either take a screenshot of, or we can follow up with this information. But here are some important contacts for households to be aware of. We talked in the beginning of the presentation about the importance of strengthening lines of communication in our emergency plans, and making sure that we have contact information for our family, friends, loved ones, and those in our network. This is also an important piece of communication, knowing who to reach out to if you have you or any community members that you might be talking to have any claims concerns. So FEMA, the National Flood Insurance Program, is a great place to start. Also, every state has a division of consumer services tucked into their state's Department of Financial Services or insurance. And so, the whole point of this office is exactly that, to help folks navigate insurance uncertainties and claims concerns and things of that nature. So definitely an important resource to have on hand. And then United Policyholders is a nonprofit that has a lot of great information in the about insurance, disaster insurance, claims concerns, and things like that. So definitely a resource to point folks towards. Okay, so we're next going to talk about some renter-specific information, because like we mentioned before, we don't want to leave renters out of this conversation. We want to make sure that they have the information that they need to get prepared for disasters. And so the key theme that we're going to see here is the importance of documentation. And so, we'll start off here with, if any damage does occur and the property is impacted, the first thing that we want to encourage renters to do is take videos, take pictures, have that documentation on hand. It's important for renters to know that, within their rights, one of them is that they are entitled to property repairs. And so if a renter is going to go ahead and submit a request for the repair, let's get that in writing. Let's have our paper trail, and let's, make sure that renters are equipped with that. It's a safety measure that they have that in writing. And then also, if a renter needs to leave their apartment for a period of time, again, we want to put that in writing. We want to take no chances. And the other thing that's most important here is that we want to make sure that renters know their lease termination rights and those specifics. And so we want to encourage renters to read through their policies, read through their contract, and know what their specifics are. We have a wonderful guide on our website that goes more in depth on some renter specific tips for preparedness and then also for recovery. So definitely want to point you to that resource. So then we are starting to wrap up here. And the last section that we're going to talk about is securing important documents. We have the different documents that we want people to organize and protect during a disaster. We have that categorized into 4 main categories. That's our personal documents, our household documents, legal and financial, and our medical documents. And I'm not going to read through everything on this list, but we do have a longer checklist on our website if folks would find that to be helpful to have that printed and then to physically check that off. But some important things to highlight here are, for our personal documents, that's things like driver's licenses and birth certificates and marriage licenses and things like that. So that's what we mean with personal documents. Household documents, you'll see a lot of contact information, because again, we know that it's so important to be able to stay in touch with your network in a disaster time. So whether that's family, employer, school information, we also have things like your service and utility providers, local government emergency services, and things of that nature. So a lot of contact information that's important to have safeguarded for you to then access in a disaster time. Financial and legal documents. These are, again, same with the home inventory. These are going to be so important to have safeguarded and to be able to access post-disaster, because they're going to expedite the process of either applying for disaster aid or applying for insurance monies. And then our last topic here, our last category rather, is our medical documents. And so these are so critical because post-disaster, you may not be treated by your typical provider. And so in order to make sure that you get the care that you need, you want to have all of your information so you can provide that. So whether that's a medical history, current prescriptions, medical equipment information, this is all key information to have and to, again, be able to easily access. When we talk about safeguarding our important documents, we're talking about doing it in 2 ways. And we do recommend using both, taking a 2-pronged approach to securing your documents. So first is your online protection. So maybe that's putting your documents on a flash drive or getting them on the iCloud, or even something like taking pictures of your documents on your phone and creating an album on your phone that you have all of that information in that area. So we definitely want to make sure that this information is getting online and secured virtually. But in addition to that, it's important to safeguard documents physically. And so we have a waterproof folder, a waterproof/fireproof box here. And so what's critical is that we want these physical containers to be removed from the property, removed from harm's way. So maybe you have a trusted family member or friend who lives a couple states away, asking to keep your copies there is just going to be a helpful measure to make sure that you can access these documents if your property gets impacted, which hopefully it doesn't. But the whole point of this is making sure that we're prepared and we have our backup copies. So with that, I really appreciate everyone hanging in there. I know that was a lot of information, but it is so important that we're equipping folks with the knowledge and the tools and the resource they need to get prepared. And so we're reviewing what we covered today. The first was knowing risks, and our top recommendation there was risk factor, because remember, it gave a really comprehensive picture of an individual's flood, extreme heat, extreme wind, and wildfire risks. So a really great comprehensive tool that can help guide informed decision-making and informed household planning. Recovery plans. We talked about making your larger preparedness plan. So, different things for pulling together your disaster supplies kits, your emergency plans, and top considerations there. And then we spent a lot of time talking about recovery planning. What are those 4 main mechanisms of recovery funding that a family can rely on post-event? And of course, that includes disaster insurance was a key part of the conversation, knowing your renter rights, and ensuring that renters are not left out of the conversation, and protecting important documents. So we're going to go ahead and wrap up here. We will open it up for any Q&A that folks may have. But first, wanted to share out that we have a lot of great resources on our website. We have a picture of it here, but probably more helpful is the link, and the resource hub is where you can access upcoming webinars, but also handheld resources, virtual versions, but you can certainly print them, checklists, guides, and flyers and things of that nature. So definitely want to direct folks there for more information. We have SVP's contact information here. I think there are probably some questions since I see some messages in the chat. So we'll certainly take them live. But if anyone does have any questions that pop up later tonight, tomorrow, later in the week, please feel free to reach out. Our contact information is here for SVP's Prepare program. And I'm happy to talk in more depth about anything that we covered today.
Thank you, Tessa. We do have one question. It's if people want to tackle at least one of these steps you mentioned today, which one would you recommend they start with this weekend?
Oh, that's a great question. So where would I start? Oh, it's tough because there are so many. We want everyone to take all of these actions, but I know, we only have so much time in any given day. One thing that I would start with, and this might not come as a shock, but it's the lines of communication. And so what I would do is make sure, and certainly don't have to start here. You could start anywhere, where we presented on today, but I would personally start with making sure that I have the contact information for all of my family and friends and loved ones in handheld written contact cards. So, we talked about the fact that power outages can happen at any time of year with any type of storm event. And so it's great to have all this information on your phone, but we don't have these phone numbers memorized anymore. At least I don't. And so if your phone loses its juice, then you're not in a good place. So that's a great entry point. It's free, it doesn't cost any money, it just takes some time. So that's a good starting point. And then and I know you only asked for one, Leanne, but I'll just say another thing that we always want folks to keep top of mind is your disaster supplies kits. These kits, if we're planning throughout the year, they can get pulled together throughout the year. So if we want to take advantage of, different sales and discounts and, items as they go on sale throughout the year, that's something to always keep top of mind, because it doesn't have to get pulled together in one weekend. We can take slow but sure steps throughout the year to build our kits. So that's another great one that folks can at least start with. If you go to the grocery store and there are any sales, get that bottled water, get that can opener, whatever that might be.
Thank you. I agree. Those are great ways to start for sure. So if anyone has some free time this weekend, make sure to get started with the both of those. But I believe that concludes our Q&A session this evening. Like Tessa said, if you have any questions, feel free to email us at prepare@sbpusa.org. I put a link in the chat. Please feel free to fill out our 1-minute post-presentation survey. We designed this to evaluate learning and give us some feedback. And also mark your calendars because the next session is on Thursday, October 24th from 6 to 7:15 p.m. We'll be covering mental health preparedness, focusing on disasters, how disasters impact mental health, and how community organizations and officials can help vulnerable members better prepare mentally, enabling them to take further preparedness action. So make sure not to miss that. And again, thank you for joining us, and I hope you all have a great evening.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Lan, and thanks, Tess, for your presentation.
Thank you so much, everyone. Have a good one.